So I'm talking today with Hilton all the way in South Africa. Well, I'm here in Chicago, United States. Really looking forward to our topic today. It's very much about a very specific functionality that was rolled out by Microsoft. February was when it was announced and it started coming out. We're going to be talking about Viva Connections. So Microsoft Viva Connections. A lot has come out from the first announcements in February to right now in April. So we're going to be digging into what we know so far, the pros, cons, good, bad, everything around it. Very much looking forward to it. First, we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves very quickly, and then we'll dive into it. So Hilton, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me on. Very excited to have this chat. You know, you and I have been connecting a lot on LinkedIn and whatnot around this topic, so we both got lots of thoughts, and I'm been enjoying the content that you've been producing, and I'm very excited to chat with you about it, and let's see where this goes. In terms of, I guess, a little bit of background, I mean, I've been in the SharePoint space, you know, both of us for a long time, going on 2 decades. Not quite as old as SharePoint per se, which just had its 20th birthday, but certainly, you know, close to that kind of time. So very familiar with you know, the Microsoft corporate space, SharePoint, and obviously into, you know, M365 today, as it's called, and Teams and whatnot. But aside from that, obviously, you know, familiar with the ideas, I guess, as a result of that, of dealing with or developing systems that are aimed at employees, you know, so be it intranets, whatever it is. So, you know, a lot of kind of stuff to talk about from that perspective. We still do a lot of that work, me and my team, a lot of kind of bespoke work, I guess, consulting, working with clients directly, helping them with solutions around the cloud-based space, SharePoint and otherwise. But I'm also the founder of a company called Chit Chatter, which is CHITCHATTR. And our sort of focus there is, it's a startup focused on building apps purely for Microsoft Teams. You know, so we've got various kinds of bots and tabs and all kinds of things like that, and very familiar with the Teams as a development platform, I guess, if you like, and also, you know, the process of kind of getting apps to the store and customizing Teams effectively. You know, we work with customers as well, building internal apps and so on. So hopefully got a lot to share. We'll you know, very excited to join you, and we'll see where this goes.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited as well. Very quick introduction of me. My name is Asif Rehmani. I'm from VisualSP. Our focus very much is on helping the end user make the best use out of the tools that they have at hand. Specifically Microsoft 365, but even beyond that with Dynamics 365 and other custom web applications. You know, how do you help the user get their job done? Not just teaching them, but helping them get their job done. That's what we focus on with walkthroughs and all kinds of different functionalities. But let's dive into Viva Connections specifically. So the hottest question in my mind, and we chatted about this earlier too, as to, is Viva Connections a good idea? You know, and we want to be very honest about that. A lot of people have heard about Viva Connections, what it is, just bringing basically SharePoint within Microsoft, within Teams, but it isn't really a good idea. What do you think about that?
Well, you see, there's a lot to unpack. I mean, there's probably other things we can talk about. I'm sure we could spend the whole time talking just around that. I think, you know, we're both seeing questions around, you know, what exactly, first of all, is this Viva thing, you know, as a brand altogether? And this, you know, as I'm sure many people know, there's 4 apps in their. Connections is just one piece of that. And then, you know, we're getting questions like, you know, what is this Viva Connections? Is it really just SharePoint and Teams kind of, you know, or SharePoint inside of Teams? Is that really what kind of all there is to it? I actually saw a question on Stack Overflow just a couple of days ago. We've been able to bring a SharePoint site into Teams kind of almost since the beginning. You know, if you're building Teams apps, and by the way, when I say building that, I mean there's an app in Teams called App Studio, which is an app for kind of, you know, I don't even want to say developers. It's an app for extending Teams. You've been able to build a tab without any development skills. Like really, you know, if you can copy paste, you could kind of do this level and embed a SharePoint page inside there. So some people are asking, you know, is Viva Connections more than that? The important thing to understand is it's not just simply that. There's some additional pieces that are empowering some of the additional experiences inside of Viva Connections. So things like the search extensions and the additional menuing capabilities that are enabled by clicking on the icon, things like that. So important to understand, Viva Connections is mostly SharePoint plus Teams, but it is a little bit more. Now, with that said, I mean, people are also asking, is this Viva Connections just SharePoint plus Teams? I think that's also a fascinating question. It's like asking, is this, this is this candy? Is it just chocolate and peanut butter? I mean, on the one hand, like yes, but on the other hand, it's chocolate plus peanut butter. These are the
Better
two.
together.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, there's a better together story, but we're also asking about two of the most important and most impactful technologies Microsoft's ever had. It's like, is it just SharePoint and Teams? Sure, but it's SharePoint and Teams together. You and I both had a long history in these products, and we've both seen tremendous impact that both of them can have individually in an organization. So bringing them together is a really exciting story rather than just an only kind of perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree. So SharePoint, I've been involved with SharePoint personally since 2002 is when I first got into it. And, it looked like crap at that time, right? SharePoint 2001 was just really, really bad. I'm sorry, Microsoft, it was just bad. But from there to now, it has come a long way, and that's why I've stuck with it. And then from SharePoint to Microsoft 365 Story and the whole cloud. And Teams obviously took off, especially in the pandemic, just like that. But now many organizations were asking themselves that we already have an investment in the intranet, in the SharePoint intranet, and now we know the value of Teams. We had to do it, especially in the pandemic, and now we know we cannot live without it. Now, what do we do?
Sure.
We got SharePoint, we got Teams. All right, well, how do we bring it together? So this home site app functionality came out kind of rudimentary before, and people were already doing it. And then, like you said, people who wanted to do it could do it, but there was no supported model where Microsoft said, all right, we're going to support it in this first party app way to have your investment in SharePoint, which is huge for many, many, many companies, and your investment in Teams come together as one. So that's, in my mind, how Viva Connections came to be.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great, great idea. You and I, once again, both are huge fans of both products, and bringing them together is just logical. And now having it supported by Microsoft. So that's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, okay, so having said that, we have SharePoint within Teams. Great. There are other apps as well. Let's talk about that a little bit. There's just a little bit. We're going to come back to Viva Connections again. The Viva Insights, Viva Learning, and Viva Topics. Do you see any specific connections of those apps with Viva Connections?
Well, the brand, the name.
Yes.
It's it is actually quite interesting because there's a huge amount of press and attention and whatnot on the Viva brand, but it is to some extent it's for maybe it's just because my glasses, my perspective, but it seems to be the biggest product that I can remember from Microsoft in recent years that isn't actually a product.
Yes.
Viva is you can't go and buy Viva, the Viva brand. It's stuff in Teams, so you have to have Teams, and with Connections you have to have SharePoint already. So it's very much more of a the way I'm sort of telling customers about it is it's a brand and it's a suite of products. Interesting enough, you bring on the other ones, the others as well, and we're specifically talking about Connections. Of the four, Viva Connections is the only one you can't go into the Team store, type the name, and go ahead and get it installed. So the deployment story is interesting, shall we say? There's a little bit more to getting it rolled out, and and one can argue whether it should be that way, shouldn't be, whatever it is.
I believe Microsoft has mentioned that that's going to change. The story is going to change, so there will be an app eventually. Currently, it's PowerShell. It's not too difficult to do, but yeah, it will become easier.
Yeah. But I think also, one might well find that the deployment story will, the process of kind of getting it deployed and getting it shall we say the rollout, might always be different for that, because you might find, if you think about, let's say, topics, pick your enterprise, but probably not every user in every enterprise is going to make sense to have Viva topics running, aside from the pricing. But not everybody needs to be doing extensive knowledge discovery, shall we say, whereas pretty much every user in the organization needs to have access to the intranet. Every employee is an employee and therefore needs the employee handbook. If you want to kind of think of a simple example. So I think Viva Connections will always be the one where IT will plan to do a rollout, automatically pin it to the left menu for everyone, that kind of thing. So but it's again quite an interesting story right now.
It is. So let's step back to what you already mentioned, the Viva brand. why do you think Viva brand was actually created? What was the reason for it? And you and I were talking about that also. So I'll let you talk about that a little bit more,
Yeah,
actually. Why do
yeah.
you think?
Again, I mean, a great question. I think it's also interesting. We've been seeing information around the timelines. And this was not a product that was announced due to come at some vague point in the future. As soon as Viva brand was announced, Topics was immediately available.
Yeah.
Microsoft gave us a timeline, and a lot of things have actually come in ahead of schedule. And the only way they've been able to do that is not because they've been working nights and weekends. A lot of the things were available already. Insights, for example, there was an app already that they used as the basis and are extending tremendously. Even Connections is GA in inverted commas, air quotes, as we speak today. But it's GA for desktop, and things like the dashboard pieces and so on are not there. So there is a Viva desktop experience you can get on the connection side today, but there will be continually new enhancements and things like that coming. So yeah, I mean, I think it wasn't somebody sat down and said, let's invent this thing. To a large extent, it was, let's take some amazing things that we were already doing, even learning. There were some other apps like that in the store. It was a case of saying, well, I mean, if we take a step back, I think really probably the pandemic has really been a big driver of this. I
Absolutely.
think
No
all
doubt.
organizations, Microsoft included, was trying to understand, how do we deal with a situation? How do we engage our employees? Well, we need to engage our employees in a different way. How do we do so, and how do we be successful with it? And Microsoft, of course, wears two hats as both an employer and the provider of the amazing tools that they have and provide. So I think it was obviously some deep thinking on that side, and saying, what can we do? What can we do to fill this gap? And well, we happen to have a number of really cool things ready that we could bring under a brand, add some additional capabilities, etc., and really, release this kind of capability of, the stuff.
Yeah.
And I think the question there became, what do we call this stuff? And partly that's a name. What kind of brand do we put on it? Which at the end was Viva, but there's an umbrella term that is coming to the fore. And it was certainly a new thing for me. This idea of something called the EXP, the employee experience. It was the first time I'd heard this particular term. And there's some great research that's come out. There's a fellow by the name of Josh Berzin who's been working quite closely with Microsoft by the looks of this. He had some blog posts lined up, on launch day. So, he's been giving this some obviously some thought, and been working in the space for a long time. And we can send the link to people. In fact, what I want to do is just go ahead and share screen, and I'll share to this day, one of the best blog posts that I've read on Viva as a brand. And it's the topic of this blog post is the massive market impact of Microsoft Viva. One of the things that he says here, amongst a number of other interesting thoughts, is he talks about the era of this idea of EXP, or employee experience. There's obviously, we've got to have a 3-letter acronym version of it. It's like employee experience is 2 words, but we managed to convert it into a TLA.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the idea that he brings here is that we've had sort of several eras of major impactful software, and as you can see it on the screen here, but I'll just read it out for those who are not maybe listening to this on audio or something like that. There's kind of like an early stage 70s, 80s, maybe bleeding into 90s, of the idea of the ERP, which was a massively impactful, in many ways, the first technology project a lot of companies had in those kind of days. And then the next sort of era, whatever you want to kind of say the years being, he has a view on that, but it's not really cut and dry. It's not hard and fast, shall we say. But the next kind of key set of technologies was the idea of the CRM. I mean, this is obviously where Salesforce and whatnot came about and so on. But this was, again, a new idea for a lot of companies, and grew tremendously because it was obvious how useful the set of capabilities could be. And then, the next stage of this is what he's talking about, the idea of this EXP. So we see a lot of companies that have played in this space, HR software and et cetera. But as I said, the first time I'd sort of seen this umbrella term, but it's really software aimed at employees. And again, I think the pandemic really made this, gave it the focus that this was clearly something employees or companies needed to take a lot more seriously. So then, that's something, that again, I'm sure we can drop the link to that or whatever, but it was certainly an eye-opening article for me to kind of get my head into the space.
The way I look at this also, thanks for the explanation, by the way, this makes a lot of sense, going from ERP to CRM to EXP, going here on forward. There's a focal point of people that EXP targets. People is what you want to put everything around. So the insights is about people, the learning is about people, the connections is about people. The topics is all about what the people want. You bring folks, employees specifically, at the focal point of all of your efforts. And if you don't do that, you already know that you're going to lose those people. And I think this trajectory has been a long time coming. We call this user adoption, we call this user support and all that stuff. And now it's the user experience. What is the user experience all about?
Absolutely.
So I feel EXP is just an evolution of all this trend that has been happening, not just within Microsoft, as the article here says, Microsoft, Workday, Qualtrics, Medallia, ServiceNow, everybody has been focused on that. And there's even more companies that are not listed here that are actually focusing on that as well. And I completely agree with Josh Bersin, who I've also been following and connected on LinkedIn as well, actually, for a long time, that this is here to stay. If you don't focus on people, you lose the people. And then you have the technology that nobody's using. What's the point?
Yeah.
Right? What's the point of all that?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of what the goal of this session obviously is not to discuss our products too much, but one of the products that we have under the Chatter brand is a tool called Teammate, and its goal is to be it's an onboarding. I mean, it happens to be a bot in Teams, but its goal is to be an onboarding experience. It's to guide the employees through their their first hours, days, weeks at the company in a much more or give them a much better experience. And to touch on it, the reason I do, I mean, that's just one piece of the corporate journey. But there's a lot of research that Microsoft's shared, not necessarily a lot of them, isn't stuff that they've written, but a lot of stuff that they've shared around that space, which is also some great reading, just on the idea of onboarding and how the point that they bring there is that the onboard experience, never mind the whole work experience, again, just taking a slice, the onboarding experience itself can have a huge impact on many things in the employee's journey. Obviously, time to productivity, like the faster you get them onboarded, the sooner they can actually be doing their job. But more than that, even things like retention, which you wouldn't think, like if you've been there 5 years, presumably, maybe you're happy, for example. But it's interesting that the initial onboard can even control or can even influence whether the employee is happy at the company altogether over some sort of longer period in time altogether. A lot of employees say that they've had terrible onboard experience, and we see it. We see users who are, or employees who are either left to their own devices, or the manager wasn't there that day, so he was sick, and so everybody forgot, and like the person was never onboarded properly, all kinds of things, inconsistencies, etc. So and that's just one piece of the experience. Obviously, if we look at the overall employee experience of trying to get my job done and trying to be a balanced employee, and give my best to the company, but also try and be a human and all of that kind of stuff. It's a critical space, absolutely. Particularly highlighted by the pandemic. We were all working from home and trying to be, ex-employee and mommy and daddy and cook and housekeeper and etc all in one. So it's been an interesting year, there's no doubt about it.
It has been. I completely agree. The onboarding experience is super important. People who don't feel supported end up leaving or being disconnected from their company culture, and you don't want that. And that has become much more relevant now in the pandemic, when so many people have worked from home, and the lines of business versus personal has kind of blurred, being at home.
Yeah, even more than that. I mean, we're seeing, a year into this thing, we're seeing, people who've joined companies, worked there for, up to a year, who've never set foot on the premises. I mean, it's a crazy thing to think about, but, it's these are the days we're living in today.
Very true. Very true. So coming back to Viva Connections here, Viva Connections currently, once again, to restate what we've already talked about, it brings the intranet. If you already have an investment, brings it within Teams, right? At the end of the day, that's what it's doing. Now, you and I have talked about what if the intranet experience needs to be different for different groups of people? And you've actually done some research and playing around with that. And I want to turn the direction in that way a little bit as to what if a corporation says, well, we're 10,000 people, we're 50,000 people, and we do want different experiences for people, not just a standard intranet experience. Now, obviously, audience targeting is there, so you can target different content, but what if it's a different site altogether, a different experience altogether? What do you think about that? First of all, is it a good idea? Second of all, Is it supported if you do it this way? What are the different ways of doing it, and so forth? So let's talk about that a little bit.
You're reminding me, we were asking about whether Viva Connections is even a good idea. We need to come back to that. But yeah, absolutely. You and I have been chatting on LinkedIn, as I mentioned, and so on. And one of the things I've posted recently on our blog is the ability to, or the concept of potentially having multiple Viva Connection apps at play. I think there's pieces that are worth understanding behind the scenes. I mean, at the end of the day, depending on you've got to read the things carefully. It's intentionally not meant to be sold that way, but at the end of the day, it's fully supported that Viva Connections really just needs to be a modern communication site. So if you have a Microsoft 365 SharePoint intranet, but it's using classic site, and I'm sure it looks great and whatnot, but if it's using classic mode, it won't work. But as long as it's a modern communication site, that's sufficient for a Viva Connections app.
Great.
Microsoft does, so it's not a requirement, but they strongly encourage you to have that site be defined as a SharePoint home site. Right. So it's a pretty easy thing to do. It's a little bit of PowerShell and whatnot to switch it into that mode. And once you do, there's other things that light up in the overall SharePoint experience, and Connections is just one piece of that. In addition to just the home icon in the SharePoint app and whatever, one of the key things that really enables, for me at least, is the idea of global nav. Again, you don't need to have it be a home site. It can be just a normal com site, but if one of the key advantages is the idea of global nav, which means that all of your SharePoint sites, and therefore your Viva Connections app, will have that menuing experience that is consistent everywhere and becomes that kind of central focus point. Another thing important to remember with Viva Connections is that search experience in Teams, the ability to have the additional search option in Teams, it's driven by the Viva Connections capability. Now, the question becomes, can we have multiple Viva Connections apps, and therefore, obviously, should we? I think the important thing to know is that it works, it's possible, but I think it's water one should tread into very carefully. First of all, whether it's supported or not. I mean, I'm playing around with Viva and seeing what's possible. Whether that's supported or a good idea is yet to be seen. Microsoft certainly hasn't. Well, it seems like people like Satya Nadella aren't yet reading my blog, which is an absolute shock to me. But nevertheless, we haven't heard whether that's a supported story or not. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be. We're not breaking any of the rules by simply choosing a different site. There is a process to get it up and running. You've got to deploy the two apps, and you have to target the sets of users. But I think the bigger question really should be that it should be by exception in my mind. Absolutely, even though it's possible, it should be by exception. I think there's so much you can do with intelligent targeting of the menu items, of the actual components that are on your SharePoint site. Dashboards is a new piece of Viva Connections that's still to come, but even that will support extensive audience targeting and so on. Really, targeting is where you should start. You should have a very good reason to want a different thing. If you've got sales guys and engineering guys, for me, that shouldn't be a reason to have multiple Viva Connections. There should be a way to design the intranet more effectively that it's catered to that experience. Where I see this being at play is that, you have a holding company, and the holding company owns the Office 365 licensing, but you've got two totally different, two or more totally different companies under that banner who have potentially no interaction between them. There's no shared resource, there's no shared capability. It's a totally different different business, different operations, et cetera, et cetera. So having one standard homepage, one standard global nav, those kind of things is going to be really challenging, especially, things like the branding and the theming. I mean, those companies, different everything, color schemes, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, that's where I see this capability being important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's what I was going to go around here, as well as to what is the size of the organization that Viva Connections is good for. And I think this kind of plays into the same thing that you're saying right now, and it's not just the size, but it's also the structure. And if it is, like you said, if it's a holding company and it might need separate, I think, at least from my perspective, Viva Connections could and should work for all sorts of companies. Anything from even 50 onwards, you have an intranet, or you have some communication, and you bring it in. And then you decide if you want multiple or not, keeping in mind, as you said, that if you do have multiple Viva Connections app, it's not going to be supported, but you can still do it. And there is no top limit, obviously, as to how many people you can have for Viva Connections. So is there ever a point where Viva Connections is not a good idea? Which I guess kind of goes back to our original
Yeah,
question, is
sure.
Viva Connections is a good idea to begin with? So
Yeah.
maybe combine two of them. Then what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really important question, I think, for various reasons. I think, again, we've talked about, Viva Connections is SharePoint plus Teams. I think the question really becomes like, what is that SharePoint story? The companies that have SharePoint intranets, like it's a no-brainer. In my mind, I think it's easy to do. It's a really simple thing. There's no cost, and it just brings the two together nicely. Users have the users have the option. Those who want to work in the browser can continue to do so. Those who want it in Teams and whatnot. But the point, the kind of obvious point we've skipped over is you have to have a SharePoint site in order to present it. It's it sounds obvious, but I mean we work sometimes with really small customers, 10, 20, 50 people, things like that, who don't have a SharePoint intranet.
Yeah.
They have content. This is really important. They have content, like we were talking about earlier. Every employee, every employer needs to have some basic stuff as an employer, things like an employee handbook.
Yep.
Companies, not everybody does have, but everybody should have a handbook. That doesn't mean they necessarily need an intranet, a fancy branded intranet to present that content, but they need to have the content. But if they don't have, a SharePoint visual web kind of experience, and it's never been as easy to do so. You can fire up the lookbook and get a beautiful something very quickly. It doesn't have to cost an arm and a leg, but it's, you have to have a site to present to users. If you don't, I mean, I don't know whether I would say put Viva Connections in place in order to get that. Like, you have to go through the intranet journey properly and the maturity journey properly to get an intranet in place. You're going to want news publishing. Well, who's going to publish news? If nobody's going to take that role, as an example, like if that kind of role and all of those things, maybe Connections isn't right for you, which again is really typically in my mind going to be very small companies. Maybe call it 50, less than 50 is probably a little too small to really justify the effort of somebody setting up and maintaining that kind of intranet. The other thing to think about, though, and this is a much broader question, is the idea of Viva Connections in principle. Is this Viva Connections thing even a good idea? Look, I'm inclined to think yes. But it's also our job as we're both MVPs, but we don't actually represent Microsoft. We certainly don't work for them, so we get to ask these fun, hard questions. Where I think it's interesting is that there's an element of feeling like Connections kind of shoehorns SharePoint into, shoehorns an intranet experience into Teams, and for me the question is that the right thing to do? Teams is not it's not a CMS content kind of system, and I've been presenting talks on this topic for since before Viva Connections as a brand existed, and it's always been a question for me of when we're moving to Teams as a kind of a sovereign app, as a kind of key app that's running on the desktop, and we want to reimagine, or we have the opportunity to reimagine what we're trying to do with an intranet. We're trying to, at the end of the day, an intranet doesn't need to be a web-based CMS. It's a set of services. It's access to its content, it's access to content, it's search, it's things like that. But it doesn't necessarily need a web-based CMS engine. If we've got a great SharePoint intranet, sure, Connections make sense. But if we don't, maybe there are other alternatives. There's an idea of whether you could have whether your intranet could be a team inside of Teams, and whether there's some sort of experience around that. Again, something we speak about. I've got a talk coming up in a couple of days on the I forget what the conference is called. What's that one coming up this week? It's out of my head.
365 virtual marathon.
Yes, yeah, the virtual marathon. That's right.
I'll be there too. Yeah, speaking.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure. So that's I'm sure a link we can give to people as well. And I'll discuss this topic a little bit more and look at some alternatives. But as an example, some of the traditional vendors in the space, and I don't want to mention specific names, but I'm sure many of the audience will be familiar with them. The traditional SharePoint, turnkey intranet in a box kind of vendors. Their stuff continues to work, and their SharePoint modern communications site will function as a Viva Connections app. But some of the more innovative ones have been looking at different ways of delivering an intranet in the space of Teams, like a bot or tab or bot and tab kind of experience. We see Company Communicator is a hugely used free open source app from Microsoft, one of the Teams app template things. We see it, widely used, and it's a way to communicate with staff using, sending messages via the bot. I mean, maybe that's the way we should be sending news to people. I certainly don't know the exact right answer, but just as an example, it's a way to think about some other alternatives to Viva Connections altogether. So it's certainly an interesting space, and I think it's maybe a case of not, one size doesn't necessarily fit every scenario.
Yeah, I completely agree. The intent of the intranet, the intent of the digital workspace has to be completely grasped before you can think if it's a good idea or not. And there are different ways of doing it, like you suggested. Vendors are innovating, Microsoft itself is innovating, and we're going to see different variations. When Hilton and I were talking about before, I also gave my own thought, at least this is just a projection, who knows what's going to happen really, that everyone, all of us are conditioned with the internet being in a browser and being presented with web components, web pages. And all we have tried to do with SharePoint intranet also since the beginning was bring that similar experience within your own firewall, right? So the web component piece of it, I don't see it going away anytime soon unless the internet changes, because we do want that kind of similar seamless experience coming in when they're coming in, the employees coming in from internet to intranet. But it is true that it could be augmented with other experiences, with the bot, with the tabs and other stuff like that. At the end of the day, what are we trying to do with any website or intranet site? We're trying to get the information to the users as efficiently as possible, whether they see it the first coming in, or they're searching for it, or they're browsing. It's just got to be easy to get that communication that we have to them, and hopefully let them interact with it as well.
Yeah.
So
Well,
we'll see
don't
exactly
forget it's the information and the experiences. So
yeah,
it's things
absolutely.
like the handbook, but it's also the ability to apply for leave and
Yes.
submit an expense claim, all of those kind of things. It's that whole
Much
sort of set of
faster.
tools.
Yeah. So let's end on one topic. We're almost time over here. There is this extensibility component that's going to be coming out. It's not out yet, but it's the dashboard component, right? That's going to be coming out with the mobile version of Connections, as I understand it also. What do you understand as the value proposition of dashboard? Not the technical aspect of it, but the value proposition as to why that's important and how will companies be using it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see. I think in terms of timing, I mean, maybe just to be clear on that, I think it's future. Mobile
Someday.
app will definitely support dashboard, but the timing isn't necessarily linked to that. Dashboard will come out at some point, mobile will come out at some point, and mobile will at some point include dashboard as well. You know what? I mean, maybe it's worth sharing some screens on these things. I'm
Sure.
conscious that not everybody's necessarily seen the same things that we've seen.
Yeah, yeah.
It might even be worth just having a quick look at Viva Connections altogether. Should we do that? As if maybe just do like a 20-second demo in case people haven't
Let's
seen
do it.
the functionality running. So if I kind of start there, and we'll transition into the what the other topic we were talking about. So basically, I'm in Teams. I'm a regular user. I'm in Teams, and I'm doing my stuff. One of the I've got all these various apps in the, in what they call the left rail. So, obviously the standard stuff like Teams and meetings and so on, but there are other Microsoft apps like approvals and whatnot that I can pop in there, and communities, etc. The idea with Connections is that I can go ahead and install an additional app and ideally sort of pre-install it for users, and I can choose even where it goes on the menu. So obviously the most recommended place is up on the top left. And when they do that, what we're doing is we're going and we're inserting our SharePoint site in. And now this is not a fancy one. This is really just a lookbook that I provisioned for the tenant. But if I go ahead and load that tenant up, here's the traditional experience of the SharePoint intranet, and exactly that same site is embedded in here. That was by design. That's what I've done. I've said that's my, the site I want to use, and the site I've configured as a home site and whatnot, and I'm embedding that experience in. So that's the kind of the simple nuts and bolts, if you like, of the experience. But the other kind of little special bits of Connections are the ability to, when I'm in that app, to click the icon again and get some additional menu. And that's effectively that global nav, the standard SharePoint global nav. So all of these kind of capabilities are appearing inside there. And then the other bit is the additional search. So when I have Connections installed, I don't just get standard Teams search, which will search inside of Teams content. I guess this additional search option, search sort of source or location. And when I go ahead and load that up, that will load the actual Microsoft 365 search. Incidentally, I mean, you and I have been chatting,
Yeah.
I've been playing around with other alternatives with Viva, where if you're using something like the PNP Modern Search web parts, you could decide that you want to send the users to another search experience inside of connections, and that's actually possible to do. But certainly by natively, it'll go ahead and send them to the to the M365 search. And I've just got some sample things that I've been playing around with in here. But yeah, so that's kind of the native search or the native Viva Connections experience. I guess worth worth showing. What I wanted to show, but is to come back to your question. We were talking about dashboards. Again, this site was just the lookbook that I provisioned. So
Right.
there's nothing in here other than what lookbook decided it should be and what lookbook used when it provisioned. Obviously, I can go ahead and change that. But if we look at the actual connections capability, I'm actually going to load. It's just a slide deck that I presented recently. I'll see if I can find the connections capability, because that'll be useful to see. But what you were talking about with dashboard is the section on the side is probably not a great screenshot in retrospect, but it's focused on mobile. But we can see underneath there the dashboard experience, and then in the mobile view, we see dashboard as being one of those options. And the idea here is it's a set of almost like tasks that we could interact with. It's not just news, and I say that, I mean, that's not really fair to news, but it's the idea with news is kind of consumption content. It's things that we read, whereas these dashboard parts are things that we click on. We can read them, but we can also click on them. They can launch to other pages, but they could also be things that I can interact with in the page, like a survey that I can interact with directly, or a task to complete a task that's been assigned to me, things like that, as part of the Viva Connections experience. Submitting maybe those things we were talking about, submitting expense claims, doing approvals, things like that. So just to be clear again, this part isn't available yet, but it is something that's due to come in the near future.
Yeah, I think it'll be pretty exciting to have that, because it is almost a launching mechanism, right? To go from your teams to your intranet to wherever you want to go. And that's how I think of dashboard in a nutshell. It is my dashboard to my internal company world. Simple links all the way to complex applications, leave applications, whatever else. So good stuff coming.
Yeah.
I think we're all going to be hacking at it like you've already been doing, doing things where it should not be doing. We'll do all kinds of things and stretch the connections and other stuff out to its extreme. So great chatting with you, Hilton. This was pretty awesome. I hope everybody else also got a lot out of it. It's a developing story, like I said. So check out Hilton's blog, and I'll be putting stuff on my blog as well as we learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. Asif, again, once again, just want to say thank you for the chance to be on. It was great chatting with you. So I'm sure people can detect it's something I'm really passionate about, and I know your side as well. So yeah, it was great to have a chat. Thanks so much.
Same. Take care. All right.